All right, get ready to dive deep into shared leadership. And not just the theory. We've got a real-world case study for you today. OP Financial Group, a major Finnish financial services company.
The timing here is really interesting, right? OP was already transitioning to a more agile working culture. And that, by definition, means distributing leadership more widely. And then the pandemic hit. So they had to figure out remote work on the fly, all while trying to implement this new leadership model.
Yeah, talk about trial by fire.
Yeah.
So for this deep dive, we're looking at a master's thesis. It examines how shared leadership is actually working in 4 of OP's back office teams, now that things are settling into a hybrid model. And the big question, one I'm always thinking about, does shared leadership actually boost team performance?
Well, to answer that, maybe we should define what shared leadership even means, at least in this context. It's not just delegating tasks, right? It's more about this dynamic interplay where team members kind of lead each other based on their own strengths and expertise.
So it's less about a rigid hierarchy and more about a fluid, almost organic distribution of leadership, depending on what needs to get done.
Exactly. And this connects with the ideas of self-organization and learning organizations, which were really central to OP's agile transformation.
Okay, so break those down for me. Self-organization, is that about teams finding their own rhythm and structure?
Yeah.
Without needing a top-down hierarchy.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Think of it like a jazz ensemble.
Yeah.
You know, each musician knows the melody, but they have freedom to improvise and bring in their unique talents.
I like that. Okay, and a learning organization, that's like a living thing, constantly evolving and adapting based on feedback and experience.
Yes, and that's where psychological safety comes in. Absolutely critical, because to really be a learning organization, people need to feel safe to speak their minds, share ideas even if they're half-baked, and admit when they've messed up without being judged or punished for it.
Right, it's about vulnerability being a strength, not a weakness.
Exactly, and what's interesting is the thesis found that. While the teams were generally positive about shared leadership, all 4 of them, giving and receiving feedback was a challenge across the board. Even in a company intentionally moving towards a more collaborative model, feedback seems to be a sticking point for everyone.
That's fascinating because it seems like just changing the leadership structure isn't enough. You also need to help people develop the skills.
And create a culture where feedback is a tool for growth, not a weapon.
Exactly. And this is where things get really interesting. The thesis highlighted one team in particular, Team 10. They had the highest level of shared leadership, and they also achieved the best performance during the study period.
Wait, so the team that embraced shared leadership the most also performed the best. That's a pretty strong correlation.
It is. Of course, correlation doesn't equal causation. There could be other factors, but it definitely raises some interesting questions. Okay, I'm hooked. Tell me more about Team 10. What were they doing differently? What was special about their dynamic?
Well, the thesis dives into their team culture and highlights how high their levels of trust were. Open communication. And of course, that psychological safety we were just talking about. The team members truly felt empowered to participate in decisions and influence the outcomes.
So it wasn't just about sharing responsibility. It was about creating an environment where people felt safe and empowered to actually lead.
Precisely. And while the thesis doesn't explicitly say how they built that trust, I think it's safe to say it didn't happen overnight.
Yeah, building trust takes time, consistent effort, and a willingness to be vulnerable with each other.
You know, it's like that saying, trust arrives on foot but leaves on horseback. It's so much easier to break trust than to build it.
That's so true. Makes me think, if Team 10 was doing so well with shared leadership and performing at such a high level, what can other teams learn from them, maybe even outside of OP?
Yeah, that's the question, isn't it? The million-dollar question. I mean, the thesis doesn't give us a step-by-step guide, but there are some clues in there.
Okay, I'm all ears. What clues?
Well, remember how all the teams said feedback needed work? Even Team 10. So giving and receiving feedback effectively seems crucial for shared leadership. But it's also something you have to constantly work on.
It's funny, right? We usually talk about feedback with managers and their teams, but when you've got shared leadership, feedback takes on a whole new meaning.
Oh, absolutely. It's not top-down critiques anymore. It's more like a multi-directional flow. Perspectives and observations.
Yeah, everyone has something valuable to share. It doesn't matter what their title is.
Exactly. And that means people have to change how they think, both giving and receiving feedback.
And that's where psychological safety comes back in, right? If you don't feel safe enough to give constructive criticism or to admit you've made a mistake, the whole feedback loop breaks down.
You got it. Psychological safety is the foundation for a culture of open and honest feedback.
A space where people can take risks, be vulnerable, know their contributions are valued, even when they make mistakes.
Exactly. And this brings us to another big takeaway from the thesis: communication.
Okay, communication. That seems pretty broad. What about communication stood out to you, in the context of shared leadership, I mean?
Well, with Team 10, communication wasn't just about getting tasks done or relaying information. It was about building relationships, understanding different perspectives, and fostering a shared sense of purpose.
So less transactional, more about making real connections within the team.
Right. And that deeper connection led to trust and a feeling of shared ownership, which are both essential for shared leadership to work.
This makes me think about that idea of active coworkership. You mentioned it earlier. It seems like good communication is a huge part of that.
Oh, absolutely. Active coworkership means going beyond just your own tasks. You're thinking about how you can help the whole team succeed.
So being proactive, helping colleagues, sharing what you know, and like we've been talking about, open communication.
Exactly. And all of that is even stronger when it happens in a culture of psychological safety and trust.
It's like a positive feedback loop, isn't it? People feel safe and trusted, so they're more likely to communicate openly and contribute actively, which then makes the trust within the team even stronger.
I like that positive feedback loop. Really good way to visualize it. And this brings us to something else important about shared leadership. The thesis touches on it: embracing diversity.
Diversity. That's something I'm really passionate about. How does it play into shared leadership being successful?
Well, think about it. Shared leadership is all about using everyone's unique strengths and perspectives. And a diverse team naturally brings more to the table: more experiences, skills, viewpoints.
So it's not just about checking a box or filling a quota. Diversity is a key ingredient for shared leadership to be truly effective.
Exactly. Diverse teams are better at creative problem solving, identifying blind spots, making decisions that represent the people they serve.
And that goes back to being a learning organization. A team that embraces diversity is constantly learning and growing.
Right. Diversity fuels innovation and adaptability, which are both essential for any organization these days.
It's interesting. We've been talking about shared leadership with this one case study, OP Financial Group. But I think the principles apply to so much more, beyond just this one company.
I completely agree. Shared leadership isn't just some trendy management idea. It's a fundamental shift in how we think about leadership in the 21st century.
It's about moving away from the hero-leader myth and recognizing that leadership is a group effort.
Right. It's about empowering everyone at every level to step up and lead, to use their talents, to work together.
This deep dive has really made me rethink my own ideas about leadership. Makes me realize we all have the potential to lead, no matter what our job title is.
That's a powerful realization.
Yeah.
And it brings up another question. You said earlier that just distributing responsibility isn't enough. So what are the potential pitfalls, the challenges organizations might face when they're trying to make shared leadership work?
That's a great question.
Well, one pitfall is shared leadership can sometimes create confusion, like who's doing what.
Yeah, if everyone's a leader, who's responsible when things go wrong?
That's it. So even with shared leadership, organizations need to be clear about expectations and have good communication channels.
It's about finding that balance between empowerment and accountability.
Right. Another challenge is that shared leadership needs a lot of trust and maturity within the team.
You can't force it.
Nope. It has to happen naturally through open communication, active listening, and being willing to be vulnerable.
Which takes time and effort.
It does, but it's worth it. When shared leadership is done well, you get a more engaged, motivated, and high-performing workforce.
It's like shared leadership is a journey, not a destination.
Perfect way to put it. It's a process. You're constantly learning, adapting, and evolving.
And it's a journey everyone have to be on board with, not just the people at the top.
Absolutely. It's a collective effort.
Okay, I think we've covered a lot today. We talked about the principles of shared leadership, looked at a real-world example, and talked about some of the challenges and rewards.
And we even managed to fit in a few jazz analogies.
I'm always a fan of a good jazz analogy. But before we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about, something to consider on their own leadership journeys.
Okay, I like it.
If shared leadership really is the future of work, like some people say, what skills and practices do you think are essential for people and teams to really thrive in this new environment?
Wow, that's a great question. Something we all need to be thinking about. As the world of work changes, being able to collaborate, communicate well, embrace shared leadership, those are going to be crucial skills.
And on that note, we hope this deep dive has given you some new ideas and inspiration to take back to your own teams and workplaces. Remember, The future of leadership is about working together, and we all have the power to shape that future.
Keep learning, keep experimenting, and keep diving deep. That's what makes the journey so rewarding.
It strikes me that this whole conversation about shared leadership really comes down to a shift in mindset, host speaker. From me to we.
Yeah, I like that. It's about getting away from working in silos and embracing a more collective way of leading and solving problems.
And what's interesting with this case study at OP Financial Group is that it seems like this shift in mindset actually leads to better results. Things like better team performance and people being more engaged at work.
Absolutely. What the thesis found was when teams embrace shared leadership and build that culture of psychological safety and trust, they can really achieve their full potential.
Like they're tapping into some hidden source of energy.
Yeah, and creativity too. And that energy and creativity, it can be used to reach goals, drive innovation, and deal with all the challenges of today's business world.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into shared leadership, I'm curious about something you said earlier. You mentioned that simply distributing responsibility isn't enough. So what are some of the potential problems or challenges that organizations might run into when they're trying to put shared leadership into practice?
Great question. One pitfall is that shared leadership can sometimes lead to confusion about who's doing what.
Right, like if everyone's a leader, who takes responsibility when things go wrong?
Exactly. So even with a shared leadership model, it's important for organizations to be clear about roles and responsibilities and to make sure everyone's communicating well.
It's about striking that balance, empowerment, but also accountability.
Right. Another challenge is you need a high level of trust and maturity within the team for shared leadership to really work.
It's not something you could just force, right?
Exactly. It has to grow organically through open communication, active listening, and a willingness to be vulnerable.
And that takes time and effort.
Definitely. But it's worth it. When shared leadership is done well, you end up with a more engaged, motivated, and high-performing team.
So it sounds like shared leadership is less about reaching a destination and more about the journey itself.
I like that. It's an ongoing process. You're always learning, adapting, changing.
And everyone in the organization needs to be a part of that journey, not just the leaders.
I agree completely. It's a collective effort.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. We've explored the principles of shared leadership. We dove into a real-world case study, and we talked about some of the challenges and rewards.
And we even managed to sneak in a few jazz analogies.
Always a fan of a good jazz analogy. But before we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with a final thought, something to reflect on as they continue their own work and leadership journeys.
Sounds good to me.
If shared leadership is the future of work, as some experts believe, what specific skills and practices do you think are most important for individuals and teams to really succeed in this new environment?
That's a fantastic question to end on. It's definitely something we all need to consider. As the world of work keeps changing, the ability to collaborate, to communicate effectively, and to embrace shared leadership, those skills are only going to become more and more crucial.
And on that note, we hope this deep dive has given you some new ideas, some inspiration that you can take back to your own teams. And workplaces, remember, the future of leadership is collaborative, and we all have a role to play in shaping it.
Keep learning, keep trying new things, and keep diving deep. That's what makes the journey so rewarding.